The knock came just after sundown, 3 taps soft, hesitant, like the wind itself wasn't sure if it belonged on the doorstep. Jed McCullen stood in the middle of his kitchen, holding a tin mug of black coffee. He hadn't had visitors in 4 years, not unless you counted the occasional rider who got lost and kept their hand close to their gun. The whole time, he didn't move at first, just stared at the door. The wind rattled the shutters. The dog by the stove lifted her head and gave a low growl, more confused than angry. Then came the knock again, not louder, just there. He stepped slowly toward the door, boots heavy on pine floorboards. When he opened it, the last of the sun was bleeding into the hills, turning the dust golden, and standing there barefoot, shivering, and framed in that dying light were 3 Apache girls, teenagers, maybe 15, maybe 17, all of them thin, dirt on their skirts. One of them had a cloth pressed to her leg, dark with blood. Jed didn't say anything, neither did they. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then one of them, the tallest, took a slow step forward. She didn't look afraid. She looked tired. She raised her hand, palm open, and in careful English, she said, "Please, we won't stay long, just shelter." Jed had seen war. He'd seen raiding parties and blood feuds and soldiers who didn't know how to look a man in the eyes after pulling a trigger, but he'd never seen eyes like theirs, clear, quiet, hollowed out by something older than fear. He stepped back from the door, didn't speak, just opened the space and let them in. They filed past him without a word. The tallest helped the injured one to a chair. The smallest, no more than 14, stood by the hearth, watching him like she expected the air to change. He set down his coffee, cleared his throat. "You hungry?" No answer. He tried again. "I've got beans on the stove, ain't much, but it's warm." The tall one nodded once. So he served them 3 tin bowls, 1 for each. He poured water into a clean pail and set it beside the fireplace. They didn't speak, but they ate like girls who hadn't had a full meal in days. The injured one winced when she shifted. Jed noticed the cloth around her thigh soaked. "Through now. You'll need that cleaned," he said softly. The tall one glanced up, protective, measuring. "I got clean bandages. I won't touch her." She held his eyes for a beat, then nodded once. Jed went to the cabinet, brought out a roll of linen and a jar of carbolic. He handed them to the tallest girl and stepped back. She unwrapped her friend's leg with practiced hands, delicate but sure. The wound was deep, not fresh, already beginning to swell. "Bullet?" Jed asked. The tall girl didn't answer, but the youngest one spoke, almost too soft to hear. "White men. On the road." Jed didn't ask more, didn't need to. The girl finished, cleaning the wound, and her friend bit down on the edge of her shawl, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. Jed turned and tossed another log into the fire outside. The wind picked up. The kind of wind that brings change with it whether you want it or not. They stayed quiet through the night. Jed gave them his bed and took the floor. The dog curled beside him, ears twitching at every creak of the old boards. He didn't sleep much, just lay there, listening to the breath of the house, the unfamiliar rhythm of others. When morning came, the sun painted the floorboards with gold. The girls were already up. One stood at the sink, washing the bowls. Another sat at the table, wrapping her friend's leg tighter. Jed rubbed the sleep from his eyes. "You girls got names?" The tall one turned. "Nalan," she said. "That's Tala. And the young one is Paya." Jed nodded. "You come far?" Nalan didn't answer at first. Then she said, "We walked from Fort Hollis." Jed felt something drop in his gut. That was nearly 60 miles. Through open country, hostile country. "What happened?" he asked quietly. Nalan just shook her head. "We're going to the mountains," she said. "There's family there, old family. We thought, just one night here, then we'll move on." Jed nodded. "You're welcome to rest longer, if you need." Paya looked up at him. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you help us?" He took a long time before answering. Finally said, "Because no one helped my daughter when she needed it." That silenced the room. He didn't explain further, and they didn't ask. But something shifted in the air between them. Not trust, not yet, but the start of something like it. That afternoon, He built a crutch for Tala out of spare wood and a broken shovel handle. Nalin helped him sand it smooth. They didn't speak much, but when their hands brushed, she didn't pull away. That evening, the sky turned lavender over the hills, and the wind settled into a hush that made even the barn doors creak, softly as if afraid to draw attention. The three girls sat around Jed's kitchen table, their bowls empty, the heat from the day still lingering on the worn floorboards. Tala's leg was no better. Despite the fresh bandages and the warm food, her skin had grown pale and a fever shimmered behind her eyes. Nalin had pressed a cool cloth to her forehead earlier, saying nothing, but her hands had trembled. Jed leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. He had seen fever before during the war, in mining camps, in the eyes of his wife the night she passed from childbed sickness. Once it set in deep, food and blankets would only delay the inevitable unless something was done soon. You won't reach the mountains with her in that state, he said quietly, not as a warning, but as a truth spoken aloud. Nalin didn't argue. She simply glanced toward the floor, as if that truth had been trailing her for days. I know, she said. Jed pushed off the doorframe and crossed to the cabinet, pulling down a small tin box. Inside were glass bottles. Two were empty, one half full, marked with ink-stained letters that had long faded. He set it down gently on the table. There's a doctor in Ash Hollow, he said. He might have quinine, maybe laudanum if we get desperate, but he won't help you if he sees your faces, especially not hers. He motioned toward Tala, who now dozed against the backrest, her lips cracked, her breath too shallow. I'll go, Nalin said immediately. Jed shook his head. They'll never let you in the door. Not alone, not as Apache. Nalin bristled, her fingers tightening around the rim of the mug she held. She opened her mouth to speak, but Jed raised a hand. Not saying what's right, he said, just saying what is. She closed her mouth again and stared out the window. I can go, he offered after a long silence. Peya, who had been watching him carefully all evening, narrowed her eyes. Why would you help? Jed hesitated, then replied with the same honesty he had given earlier. Because it's wrong to watch someone die just because others wouldn't approve of who they are. He didn't say anything about the town, or the sheriff, or the risk of being seen riding in for medicine he didn't need. But he knew what the girls were already thinking. Ash Hollow wasn't just skeptical of strangers, it was suspicious of anyone who didn't look like them, think like them, or fit into the narrow expectations the town had for the world. And Jed McCullen hadn't given them a reason to trust him in years. He'd stopped going to the general store after his wife died, avoided the saloon except when he needed grain or kerosene, and kept to himself more than anyone else around for miles. If he rode into town asking for medicine, they'd ask questions. They'd wonder why. If they found out it was for 3 Apache teenagers, especially girls, they'd think worse than sickness. They'd think scandal. They'd think danger. They'd think he was hiding something. Still, he glanced down at Tala, whose lips had turned slightly blue, her cheeks flushed with the kind of fever that didn't wait for diplomacy. I'll leave at first light, he said. Nalin rose from the table, stepping forward. You don't owe us this, she said. I know. She studied him for a long moment. Then her expression softened. If they ask, she said, what will you say? Jed's eyes didn't waver. I'll lie. When dawn broke, it came pale and slow over the hills, staining the eastern sky with streaks of apricot and faded rose. Jed saddled the bay mare in silence, packed a small pouch with coins, and rolled up the letter from a distant cousin, one he hadn't spoken to in a decade, just in case he needed an excuse for being in town. The girls stood in the doorway watching him. He gave a nod and climbed into the saddle, his hat pulled low. I'll be back before dark, he said. If I'm not, take what you can and head north. Keep off the roads. He didn't wait for goodbyes, just gave the mare a nudge and rode out, leaving the sound of hoof beats in the dust and a growing weight in the pit of his stomach. Ash Hollow came into view just before noon. It was a hard town, nothing painted that didn't need to be, and nothing said that didn't mean something else. The doctor's office stood beside the old blacksmith's shop, its paint peeling and porch crooked. Jed tied the mare outside and stepped through the front door. The bell over the door gave a tired jingle. The doctor, a thin man with a cough worse than his patient's, looked up from his desk with bloodshot eyes. "You sick, McCullen?" he asked, already reaching for a bottle of whiskey from under the counter. Jed shook his head. "Got bit by a bug. Fever's set in. Head pounding." The doctor squinted. "You don't look sick." Jed let a beat of silence hang between them. "I don't feel sick yet," he said. "But I know the signs." The doctor grunted. "Quinine's dear. Shipment's late. You got coin?" Jed laid it down more than the dose was worth. The doctor looked at him sideways, then nodded. "I'll get it." As the man walked into the back room, Jed glanced around the office. Nothing had changed in for years. Same posters on the wall, same surgical tools that hadn't seen a proper sharpening since the war. He left 5 minutes later with the medicine in his coat pocket and suspicion in the doctor's eyes, trailing behind him. By the time he reached the edge of town, he'd already spotted the sheriff talking with a local rancher, pointing in his direction. He rode faster. The sun was high now, and the land shimmered with heat. He didn't slow until he could see the cabin again, tucked low against the hills. The moment he arrived, Nallen opened the door. "You got it." He handed her the bottle, and she rushed to Tala's side. Jed dismounted, his heart still hammering, not from the ride, but from what he knew. Word would reach them soon. Someone would wonder what he was doing. Someone might come looking. But as he stood in the doorway and listened to Tala begin to breathe a little easier, the sweat drying on her brow, he decided that it didn't matter. Some things were worth the trouble, even when everyone else said they weren't. The sky turned heavy 2 days later, thick with heat that pressed down on the land like a warning not yet spoken. Jed stood on the porch with a tin cup of water, eyes locked on the distant road, winding up from Ash Hollow. Dust had been rising from it since noon, faint at first, like a trick of the sun. But now it formed a long, thin trail snaking toward the horizon, unmistakably kicked up by horses. Not one dot, not two dot more dot. He didn't move. Just watched dot inside. Nallen was tending to Tala, who had finally begun to sleep through the night without crying out. The medicine had taken hold, and her fever had broken, but she was still too weak to stand. Peya had been helping gather herbs near the creek earlier that morning, and her quiet humming had floated back through the windows, like a song from a world untouched by suspicion. But now the air had shifted, and Jed could feel something closing in. He stepped back into the house. "Nallen," he said, "we might have visitors." She stood, brushing her hands on her skirt. "You mean the kind that knock?" He shook his head. "No." Peya came through the back door at that moment, a small bundle of wild onions in her arms. She looked up at Jed, then at Nallen, her eyes narrowing. "What is it?" she asked. Jed walked to the back window, pulled back the curtain. "Town riders. Coming fast." Nallen moved to the front of the cabin, squinting through the warped glass. "How many?" Jed didn't need to count again. 5. Sheriff's men, from the look of it. Peya's shoulders tensed. "Did someone follow you back?" Jed didn't answer right away. Instead, he checked the rifle prop behind the door. It was clean, loaded. Unspoken decisions hung in the air around it. Nallen spoke first. "We leave. We can still take the woods, go north like you said." Jed shook his head. "Tala won't make it 20 steps. She looked at him, jaw tight. "Then what?" Jed looked back out at the road. "We stay put." Peya crossed her arms, "And when they get here." He glanced toward the injured girl lying in the back room. "Then I lie again." It was mid-afternoon by the time the riders reached the fence. 5 men, all armed, their shirts soaked with sweat, and their faces already set in suspicion. At the center rode Sheriff Blake Talmadge, a man whose hat was always cleaner than his conscience. He was broad through the chest, narrow in the eyes, and well known for settling disputes with rope or silence. He didn't dismount, just tugged the reins and waited for Jed to walk out and meet him. Jed stepped down from the porch, calm but not smiling. "Afternoon, Sheriff." Talmadge nodded slowly. "Heard you came to town last week. Said you had a fever." Jed shrugged. "Didn't say it was mine." One of the deputies chuckled under his breath, but Talmadge didn't take his eyes off Jed. "You leave town in a hurry," he said. "People get curious. Doctor says you asked for quinine and morphine." You say you ain't sick, so who's the patient? Jed met his stare without blinking. My cousin's girl. She came down from Abilene, took sick on the road. The sheriff leaned in the saddle, spitting dust near Jed's boots. Funny, he said. We didn't see no wagon, no cousin, no letter. Jed took a slow breath. She left this morning, headed for Fort Stanton. Another silence. Then Talmadge said, You got strangers on your land. McCullen. Jed didn't answer right away. From inside the house, he could feel 3 pairs of eyes watching. One of them was scared. One of them was angry. And the third, the one lying on the cot in the back room, was too sick to care anymore. He turned his attention back to the sheriff. I got tired of being alone, Jed said. So I hired a few girls to help with the place. Cook, clean, garden. Talmadge raised an eyebrow. Girls, Jed nodded. From the orphan line, Fort Hollis. They sent who they had. The sheriff leaned back in his saddle and looked toward the house like he was weighing what he might see if he forced the door open. One of the deputies adjusted his belt and spoke for the first time. There's rumors, he said. A group of Apache girls escaped from a convoy. Said they tricked a white buyer. Took his papers. Headed this direction. Jed's mouth tightened. You think I'd shelter Apaches? The deputy shrugged. I think you live too far from town. And asked a few questions. Talmadge sat quiet for another long minute, then said, Let's see the girls. Jed's hand dropped just a little too close to his side. Not today, he said. Talmadge's tone went cold. You interfering with county business? Jed didn't back down. I gave you an answer, Sheriff. They're gone. Behind him, the house was silent. Inside, Nalin gripped the pistol hidden in her skirt, her palms sweating. Paya crouched beside the window with a carving knife clutched in white knuckles. Neither of them knew if they could outrun 5 horses, but they were willing to try. Talmadge stared at Jed for a long time. You ain't the man you used to be, he said. Used to know which side of the line to stand on. Jed looked him in the eye. Maybe I was on the wrong side. The sheriff's mouth twisted. Then, with a flick of the reins, he turned his horse. We'll be back, he said. Not without a warrant, Jed replied. Talmadge didn't answer. Just rode off, his deputies following, kicking up dust that hung in the air like a threat. Jed stood still until the sound of hooves disappeared over the ridge. Then he turned back to the house, walked up the porch, and opened the door. Inside, Nalin was already rolling up the blanket where she'd hidden the gun. Paya stood frozen near the window. Jed spoke low. They'll come back. Next time, maybe with more. Nalin nodded. What do we do? She asked. Jed looked down at his hands. I reckon we stop running. The storm finally broke that evening. Not the kind that rattled shutters or brought water to the fields, but the quieter kind. The kind that begins inside people and rolls out slow. Like thunder echoing from far-off hills, the cabin smelled of stew. The kind Jed had learned to make when there was nothing left but root vegetables and dried meat. Paya stirred it with quiet focus, watching steam rise in soft spirals outside. The lanterns glowed against the approaching dark, casting a soft halo on the window glass. Tala was resting easier now. Her fever had broken fully the night before, and though her strength wasn't back, she could sit upright, sip broth, even smile at Paya's occasional teasing. Her cheeks held a little color again, and her hands didn't tremble when she held the cup. Nalin sat at the edge of the porch, wrapped in a worn wool blanket Jed had given her the first night. Her eyes were locked on the horizon, not out of fear, but out of habit, always watching, always listening for danger she couldn't afford to ignore. Jed joined her quietly, lowering himself onto the step beside her. For a long time, they didn't speak. The wind rustled the dry grass, and crickets had just started singing in the brush. They'll come back, she said, almost to herself. Jed nodded. Most likely. Nalin drew her knees up beneath the blanket. They'll bring more men. More questions. Maybe more guns. He didn't argue. Probably. Another pause settled between them. This one heavier. The kind that didn't need to be filled. I thought you would have told them, she said, voice low. Why? You've got nothing to gain keeping us here. Jed looked out at the fading sky. A bird soared across the last orange light of the sun, wings wide, silent as a secret. I already lost everything once, he said. House stayed standing, but the inside hollowed out. This place only started feeling alive again when you three came through the door. Nalin studied him for a long time. Even with the risk, Jed turned to meet her gaze. Especially with the risk. She didn't answer, not right away. Then, slowly, she reached into her satchel, the same one she'd kept close every hour. Since arriving, from it, she pulled a small cloth bundle, tied with twine. She opened it carefully, revealing a thin strip of leather with painted beads sewn into it. The colors had faded with time, but the pattern was still clear blue and red triangles, black lines dancing between them. This was my mother's, she said. She made one for each of us, me, Tala, and our sister, before the missionaries came, before they split us up. Jed watched her fingers as she ran them over the beads. She was taken by soldiers outside Mescalero, she continued. They called it relocation, but they never gave her a grave. Her voice didn't crack. It wasn't the kind of story that needed tears to be heard. They told us we had new names, said the old ones were too hard to pronounce, said we were lucky to be civilized. Jed didn't interrupt. We escaped during the transfer, she said. There was a trader in Fort Hollis who agreed to forge papers, but he wanted something in return. Told us if we looked clean and pretty, he could get us good homes, sell us to ranchers or rail bosses. She paused, but we didn't wait. We took what we could and ran. Jed leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. I'm not a good man, Nalin, he said quietly. Not in any way that counts. I didn't fight back when this land got taken. I didn't speak up when others were silenced. And I spent too many years thinking grief gave me an excuse to stop caring. Nalin turned toward him, curious now. He pulled something from his coat pocket, a tintype photo, worn thin at the corners. A woman with long hair pulled back in a ribbon, eyes soft but tired. Next to her stood a little girl, no older than Paya. My wife, Jed said, and our daughter, Mary. He paused. They died during the winter of '76. Fever came through, and I didn't have the sense to get help in time. He swallowed. Since then, I've kept this land like a tomb, fed the animals, mended the fence, but I didn't really live in it. The sun had dropped below the hills now. The stars were beginning to rise, shy and scattered across the indigo sky. Jed held out the photograph, and Nalin took it gently, studying the worn faces. She looks like she laughed a lot, she said softly. She did, Jed replied. So did Mary. Another long pause passed between them. I think they'd have liked you, he added. Nalin's eyes shimmered, though she blinked it away quickly. Even if I didn't come sturdy, she said. Smiling. Jed chuckled. You came exactly as you are. That's more than I asked for, and a whole lot more than I deserved. Inside the house, Paya was laughing now. Tala must have said something funny, and her voice, hoarse as it still was, carried joy like it hadn't known sorrow. Nalin leaned back against the porch post, her blanket pulled tight. We can't stay here forever, she said. I know. They'll come for you. I'm not afraid of them. She looked over. I am. Jed didn't argue. Instead, he nodded and said, then we'll figure out something better, together. Nalin didn't answer, but she didn't move either, and, for the first time since arriving, she let her shoulder rest lightly against his. No words, no promises, just presence. In the quiet of a land that had taken more than it gave, it was enough. They left before the second full moon. Not in the dead of night. There was nothing secretive about it, but in the early dawn, when the land was quiet and the air still held the cool breath of sleep. The day before, Nalin had asked for map paper. Jed didn't have much, but he'd carefully unfolded an old cattle route chart he used to keep pinned near the barn door. Together, they marked a new trail, one that skirted the main roads, avoided patrols, and led deep into the forested canyons northwest of Fort Stanton. They won't follow us there, Nalin said, tapping the end of her pencil on the page. Too many switchbacks, too little reason. Jed nodded. Plenty of old Kirikahua families lived out in those ridges. You might find someone who remembers your mother's name. Paya, always skeptical, had looked at him then and asked, You're not coming? He smiled faintly. I'd slow you down. Tala was standing by the fence when the wagon was finally packed, its wheels repaired with care, and a fresh crate of food tied down beneath the seat. Her leg had improved enough for short walks, but she still leaned on the crutch Jed had carved. He passed her the last of the provisions: dried beans, salted pork, half a jar of plum preserves. "You saved my life," she said, holding his eyes. "You saved your own," he replied. "I just held the door open long enough." Nalin stepped down from the porch, boots scuffing dry earth. Her face was calm, but her eyes searched the land one last time: the trees, the worn path to the barn, the spot near the stream where they'd washed linens together the week before. "Part of me wants to stay," she said softly. Jed turned to her. "You'd be welcome if you did." She smiled, small and honest. "But I didn't come here to stop moving." He nodded once. "Then go the way you came. On your own terms." They stood that way for a long while, to people who had nothing left to owe each other, but had, somehow, found something that felt like home. Peah climbed onto the wagon seat, reins in hand. "We should go," she said, glancing over her shoulder toward the hills. "The shadows are getting shorter." Nalin turned to Jed one last time. "I won't forget this," she said. "I hope you don't." She hesitated, then stepped forward, pulling something from her pocket, a small leather cord wrapped in faded beadwork. She pressed it into his hand. "My mother's colors," she said, "for your daughter." Jed closed his fingers around it. "Thank you." And then, just like that, they were gone. The wagon rolled down the road slowly, dust curling up in its wake. Jed stood at the gate, head in hand, until they disappeared behind the far hill. The land fell quiet again, just as it always had. But it was not the same. The porch still creaked in the wind. The shutters still clattered when the evenings came heavy. But now there were 2 extra chairs out front, one carved with a sun symbol Peah had etched in with her pocket knife, and the other marked by Tala's initials burned into the armrest. In the weeks that followed, the sheriff never returned. Maybe he'd been warned off. Maybe he'd decided Jed wasn't worth the trouble. Or maybe someone in town had quietly passed along word that the girls were no longer there, and that chasing ghosts across the high plains wasn't a good look for a lawman. Whatever the reason, the tension passed like a summer storm, loud, fast, and gone before the ground even drank it in. Jed kept the photograph of his wife and daughter near the kitchen window, but now, beside it, sat the beaded leather cord, a little color, a little memory, and the proof that kindness, offered without condition, can sometimes echo louder than violence ever could. He still lived quiet, still spoke little, still let the dog curl by the fire, and still patched the fences one nail at a time. But now and then, when riders passed along the far road and waved, Jed would tip his hat, and some would stop to talk. A few even stayed for supper. The house had ceased to feel like a mausoleum. It had become a shelter in the truest sense, a place where lost souls could pause, breathe, and remember that they mattered, even if only for a while. And though the girls were long gone, he imagined them often. He pictured Tala learning to walk without the crutch, Peah laughing with someone who finally understood her sharp tongue and soft eyes, and now riding through pine-covered ridges, wind in her hair, finally, free to carry her mother's name like a banner instead of a burden. Sometimes, he imagined they'd return one day, maybe not next season, maybe not the one after that, but one morning, the sound of wagon wheels might hum against the dust, and a new knock might come at the door, and this time, it wouldn't be hesitant. It would be homecoming. Until then, Jed waited quietly, not lonely, not empty. Just ready. In the place where the prairie met the sky, where silence once ruled, and kindness chose to stay.